My name is Serenya Vale, and at 17 years old, I thought being born into one of Chicago's most prestigious families was a blessing. Instead, it became the gilded cage that would teach me the cruelest lesson of my life. Blood means nothing when power is at stake. Before I tell you about the night my family threw me away like yesterday's newspaper, let me paint you a picture of what the Vale Empire looked like from the inside. Growing up in the Vale Mansion on the North Shore was like living in a museum where everything beautiful came with an invisible price tag. Our 30-room estate sprawled across 5 manicured acres, complete with marble fountains that never stopped flowing and crystal chandeliers that caught every ray of Chicago sunlight. The house wasn't just our home, it was a monument to my father's success, a shrine to the Vale name that commanded respect from every corner of high society. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Damien Vale stood at the center of it all like a king surveying his domain. At 52, my father possessed the kind of commanding presence that made boardrooms fall silent when he entered. His salt and pepper hair was always perfectly styled, his Italian suits tailored to perfection, and his steel gray eyes missed nothing. As the CEO of Vale Industries, a multinational conglomerate spanning everything from real estate to tech investments, he had built an empire worth over $2 billion. But what impressed people most wasn't his wealth. It was his absolute control over every aspect of his world, including his family. My mother, Celine, existed as the perfect accessory to his success. Once a promising art curator with dreams of her own, she had transformed herself into Chicago's most sought-after socialite. Her blonde hair never showed a strand out of place. Her designer gowns always photographed beautifully at charity galas, and her smile could charm million-dollar donations from the city's elite. But I noticed things others didn't. How her hands trembled slightly before big events, how she always deferred to my father's opinions, how her own dreams had been quietly buried beneath 25 years of being Mrs. Damien Vale. My older brother Cale was the golden child, the heir apparent who could do no wrong in my father's eyes. At 21, he had already mastered the art of charming investors while secretly funding his expensive habits through increasingly reckless schemes. Cale possessed my father's commanding presence, but lacked his discipline, a combination that would prove catastrophic years later. He treated the family business like his personal playground, and everyone from my parents to the board members enabled his behavior because, after all, he was a Vale. Then there was my younger sister, Lyra, just 15 and already showing signs of the quiet rebellion that would define her relationship with our family. While Cale basked in attention and I fought for recognition, Lyra had learned to become invisible, watching everything from the shadows with those sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She understood our family's dynamics better than any of us, perhaps because she had never been important enough to be caught in their games. I fell somewhere in the middle, too independent for my father's taste, too idealistic for the family business, but too valuable to completely dismiss. My academic achievements were stellar: valedictorian at Chicago's most prestigious prep school, early admission to Northwestern, and a sharp mind for strategy that my father occasionally praised when it served his purposes. But I made one crucial mistake that would cost me everything. I believed family loyalty flowed both ways. The Vale Industries headquarters occupied 30 floors of downtown Chicago's most expensive real estate, with my father's corner office offering a view of the city he considered his kingdom. I had spent countless afternoons there as a child, watching him command meetings and shape deals that affected thousands of lives. He had always promised that one day this would all be mine to help lead. "The Vale name means something, Serenya," he would tell me, his hand on my shoulder as we looked out at the Chicago skyline. "Never forget that everything we have exists because of the reputation we've built." What I didn't understand then was how fragile that reputation really was, and how quickly my father would sacrifice anything, including his own daughter, to protect it.
The first cracks in my perfect world appeared during my senior year in high school, when Cale's behavior began escalating beyond typical rich boy antics. Late nights became early mornings, expensive cars were returned damaged, and whispered conversations between my parents grew more frequent. But Cale was the heir, the future of Vale Industries, so every scandal was quietly buried, every mistake swept under hand-woven Persian rugs. I should have seen what was coming. I should have recognized the signs of a family preparing to cut loose anything that threatened their survival. Instead, I focused on my studies, my college applications, and my naive belief that being a Vale meant something more than just sharing a last name. The night that destroyed my life started like any other family dinner in the Vale household. Our dining room, with its mahogany table that seated 12, and oil paintings of ancestors who had made their fortunes in less scrutinized times, had always been where family business was conducted alongside the evening meal. But on this particular Thursday in March, the undercurrents of tension were stronger than usual. Cale arrived 20 minutes late, his expensive cologne failing to mask the smell of alcohol that had become his constant companion. His hair was disheveled, despite obvious attempts to fix it, and his designer shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd slept in it. Again.
Jaw tightened as Cale stumbled through an apology, but he said nothing. The Vale family had perfected the art of maintaining appearances, even when the facade was crumbling. "The Henderson account is asking questions," my father announced over the first course, his voice carrying that particular edge that made everyone at the table sit up straighter. "Apparently, someone has been making unauthorized withdrawals from the development fund, someone with access to the family accounts." Celine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Lyra kept her eyes focused on her plate, but I saw her shoulders tense. Cale, however, continued eating as though nothing had been said, either too drunk or too arrogant to care about the implications. "I'm sure it's just an accounting error," Cale finally offered, his words slightly slurred. "These things happen in big companies, right? Numbers get mixed up, transfers get delayed. $300,000 doesn't just get mixed up, son." My father's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that had made grown men in boardrooms break into cold sweats. "The Henderson family has been partners with Vale Industries for 15 years. They trust us with their money because they trust the Vale name. Do you understand what that means?" I watched my brother's face transform from casual indifference to something approaching panic. But instead of accepting responsibility, Cale did what he'd always done when cornered. He deflected. "Maybe you should ask Serenya about the account irregularities," he said, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his lie. "She's been helping with the family finances for her senior project, right? All that research into investment strategies and portfolio management?" The room went dead silent. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to stop ticking as all eyes turned to me. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as I realized what was happening, but I couldn't quite believe it yet. "That's not true," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos building in my chest. "I've been researching investment strategies for my economics thesis, but I've never had access to any actual accounts. You know that, Cale." But my brother was already building his defense, weaving truth and lies together with the skill of someone who'd had years of practice. "She's been asking so many questions about the Henderson Fund specifically. Remember, Dad? Last month she wanted to know about the development timeline, the projected returns, all those technical details." "For my research paper," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I was writing about real estate investment trusts, and you suggested I use Henderson as a case study because it was public information." Cale's eyes met mine across the table, and in that moment I saw something that chilled me to the bone. There was no guilt, no remorse, just cold calculation. He was going to let me take the fall for his theft, and he didn't care what it cost me. "I don't know, Serenya," he continued, shaking his head with practiced sadness. "You've been acting strange lately, talking about wanting to be more independent, complaining about always being in the family shadow. Maybe you thought taking some money would help you prove a point."
I looked around the table desperately, waiting for someone, anyone, to call out the obvious lies. But my mother was staring at her hands, her face pale. Lyra looked like she wanted to speak but didn't dare. And my father? My father was studying me with those cold gray eyes, weighing my words against Cale's accusations, like a judge preparing to render verdict. Cale pressed on, each word driving the knife deeper. The money was transferred using credentials linked to Serenya's research access. I mean, I'm not accusing her of anything malicious. Maybe she just got confused about what she was authorized to do. "Stop lying!" I finally exploded, my composure cracking. "You know I never had account access. You know I never touched that money. You're the one who's been bleeding the company dry to fund your gambling and drinking and whatever else you waste money on." But my outburst only made me look more guilty in my father's eyes. In the Vale family, losing control was the ultimate sin, and I had just committed it spectacularly. "Enough," my father said quietly, and the single word silenced the entire room. He stood slowly, his tall frame casting shadows across the table. "Serenya, you will come to my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. We will discuss this situation and determine the appropriate response. Until then, everyone will keep this matter within the family." The dinner continued in suffocating silence, each bite of food turning to ash in my mouth as I watched my family systematically destroy my life. Cale had returned to his meal with obvious relief, occasionally shooting me glances that mixed triumph with something that might have been pity. My mother remained frozen in her seat, and Lyra kept her eyes down, her jaw clenched tight. After dessert was cleared, I retreated to my room and spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how 17 years of being the perfect daughter had led to this moment. I replayed every conversation, every family meeting where I'd asked questions about the business, trying to find where I'd gone wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't gone wrong anywhere. I was simply the expendable child, the one who could be sacrificed to protect the heir and the family name.
I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the dark hours preparing for a conversation that would either clear my name or destroy my future. I gathered every piece of documentation I could find: my research notes, my school project timeline, even my computer's browsing history, showing when I'd accessed the public information about Vale Industries. If my father was the logical businessman I'd always believed him to be, surely evidence would matter more than accusations. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I knocked on the heavy oak door of my father's home office. The room had always intimidated me, with its dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and the massive desk where deals worth millions had been negotiated. But that morning, it felt less like a sanctuary of power and more like a courtroom where I was about to be sentenced. "Sit down, Serenya." My father didn't look up from the document spread across his desk. He was already dressed in one of his impeccable suits, his silver cufflinks catching the morning light streaming through tall windows. Even at home, Damien Vale never appeared anything less than perfectly composed. I took the seat across from him, my folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. "Dad, I know this looks bad, but I can explain everything. I have documentation that proves I never had access to..." "The Henderson family has withdrawn their partnership with Vale Industries. 15 years of trust. Gone. They've also indicated they may pursue legal action if the missing funds aren't returned immediately." My heart sank, but I pressed forward. "Then we need to find who really took the money. I know it wasn't me, and I can prove it. Look at these records." "Serenya." He finally looked up, and the coldness in his eyes made me stop mid-sentence. "The evidence is quite clear. The transfers were made using credentials associated with your research access. Your brother has provided a detailed account of your strange behavior and questions about the Henderson Fund. Most importantly, the timing coincides with your recent complaints about wanting more independence from the family. Those credentials were basic research access only. I couldn't transfer money even if I wanted to. Someone else had to have used my login information, and we both know who." "Enough." The word hit me like a physical blow. I've spent the last 12 hours consulting with our attorneys and accountants. The situation is complicated. The missing funds represent a fraction of our overall holdings, but the damage to our reputation could be catastrophic if this becomes public. I felt the ground shifting beneath me as I realized where this conversation was heading. What are you saying? My father stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out on the perfectly manicured grounds. The Vale family has survived for 3 generations because we understand that sometimes individual sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. Your grandfather built this company by making difficult decisions. I've continued that tradition. Now it's your turn to understand what that means. I won't confess to something I didn't do, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. He turned back to me, and for a moment, his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. I'm not asking you to confess, Serenya. I'm asking you to accept responsibility for a situation that has spiraled beyond anyone's control. Take the blame, help us restore confidence with our partners, and in return, the family will ensure you're taken care of. Your college education will be fully funded. You'll receive a generous monthly allowance, and after a few years, when this has blown over, there will be a place for you in the company. The offer hung in the air between us, and I realized this was my father's version of mercy. In his mind, he was being generous, offering me a path back into the family's good graces after a brief period of disgrace. But accepting would mean living with a lie for the rest of my life, letting my brother escape consequences for theft, and validating every cruel thing he'd ever said about my place in the Vale hierarchy. And if I refuse? I asked, quietly. My father's expression hardened again. Then you'll face the consequences of your choices. The family will cooperate fully with any legal proceedings, which means our attorneys will present all available evidence, including testimony from family members about your recent behavior and admitted access to the accounts. Your college plans will need to be funded through other means, and of course, you'll need to find somewhere else to live, since we can't harbor someone who's actively working against the family's interests. The ultimatum was delivered with the same cold efficiency he used to close business deals. Take the fall or lose everything. Stay loyal to the family lie or be cast out completely. I looked at him across that massive desk. This man who had raised me, taught me about business, promised me a future in the empire he'd built. And I realized that everything I'd believed about family loyalty, about being a Vale, about my place in this world, had been built on quicksand. I need to think about this, I said finally.
You have until tonight, he replied, already turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. The Henderson situation requires an immediate response. I'll need your decision by dinner. I left his office with my folder of useless evidence and spent the day walking through the house that had been my whole world. Every room held memories of birthday parties and family gatherings, holiday celebrations and quiet moments with my mother and sister. But now those memories felt different, tainted by the knowledge of how quickly it could all be taken away. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table, surrounded by my family one last time, I made my choice. But it wasn't the choice my father expected. I won't take the blame for Kyl's theft, I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the dining room. I won't lie to protect him, and I won't let you destroy my reputation to save his. The silence that followed was deafening. Kyl's face went white, my mother let out a small gasp, and Lyra's eyes widened in shock. But it was my father's reaction that I'll never forget. A slight nod, as though I had confirmed something he already suspected. Then you're no longer welcome in this house, he said simply. You have until tomorrow morning to pack what you need. After that, you're on your own. And just like that, at 17 years old, I learned that the Vale name meant nothing when you refused to play by their rules. The morning of my exile, I woke before dawn and packed my life into 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes. 17 years of memories, achievements, and dreams reduced to what could fit in the trunk of the modest car I'd bought from money from my part-time job at the local bookstore. As I folded clothes that cost more than most people made in a month, I realized how little of it would be useful in the world I was about to enter. Lyra appeared in my doorway as I was taping the last box shut. My 15-year-old sister looked like she hadn't slept either, her usually perfect blonde hair hanging limp around her shoulders, her green eyes red-rimmed from crying. "This is insane," she whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. "They can't just throw you out like this. You're family." I looked up from where I was kneeling on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the remnants of my privileged life. Apparently, being family has conditions I wasn't aware of. Lyra stepped into the room and closed the door softly behind her. "Kyle came to my room last night. He was drunk, rambling about how sorry he was, but that he couldn't tell the truth because Dad would disown him too. He said you'd understand eventually that business is business." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Even in his guilt-ridden confession, Kyle was more concerned about his own survival than the sister he was destroying. "Did you believe him about the money?" I asked. "Of course not," Lyra said fiercely. "I know you, Serenya. You wouldn't steal from anyone, let alone the family. But knowing the truth and being able to do something about it are two different things." She pulled an envelope from her hoodie pocket and pressed it into my hands. "It's not much, but it's everything I have in my savings account. $2,000 from birthdays and holidays. Take it." I stared at the envelope, overwhelmed by the generosity from the only person in my family who seemed to care about justice. "Lyra, I can't take your money." "Yes, you can," she said firmly. "Someone in this family should do the right thing. Besides, I have a plan. I'm going to document everything I can find about Kyle's spending, his debts, anything that proves he was the one stealing. When I turn 18 and have more freedom, I'll find a way to clear your name." The promise was made with the fierce determination of a 15-year-old who still believed the world could be fair if you fought hard enough for it. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, knowing it might be years before I could hold my sister again. "Don't let them break you," I whispered against her hair. "Stay smart, stay careful, but don't let them turn you into someone you're not." An hour later, I loaded my car under the cold stare of my father, who watched from his office window as I said goodbye to the only home I'd ever known. My mother hadn't come out to see me off, but I caught a glimpse of her pale face at an upstairs window before the curtains fell closed. Even that small acknowledgement felt like a victory. As I drove through the iron gates of the Vale estate for the last time, I made myself a promise. I would survive this, and someday I would make them all regret the day they chose Kyle's lies over my truth. My first apartment was a studio in one of Chicago's less fashionable neighborhoods, with thin walls, a radiator that clanged all night, and a view of the alley behind a Chinese restaurant. The monthly rent consumed most of my bookstore wages, leaving me exactly $47 for food, transportation, and everything else life demanded. It was the first time I truly understood what poverty felt like, and it was terrifying.
But terror, I discovered, could be an excellent motivator. Within a week of being disowned, I had picked up 2 additional part-time jobs, tutoring wealthy kids in mathematics and working weekend shifts at a coffee shop near Northwestern University. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now serving overpriced lattes to students whose families had half the wealth mine did, but every dollar I earned was mine, untainted by Vale money or Vale expectations. The hardest part wasn't the long hours or the exhaustion, it was the complete erasure of my identity. When people asked about my family or my background, I learned to deflect with practiced ease. "My family and I don't really keep in touch," became my standard response, which was technically true while avoiding the humiliating details. 3 months into my exile, while shelving books at the store where I worked, I met the person who would change the trajectory of my life. Orion Cross was browsing the business section, his weathered hands carefully examining a book about emerging markets. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His clothes were expensive but understated, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the register where I was working. "You're Serenya, right? The young woman who's been helping my nephew with calculus?" I recognized the name immediately. Marcus, his nephew, was one of my tutoring clients, a spoiled Northwestern freshman who'd been failing math until his family hired me to salvage his GPA. "Yes, that's me. Marcus has been doing much better with the quadratic equations." Orion smiled, and there was something in his expression that made me pay closer attention. "Marcus mentioned you have an interesting perspective on investment strategies. Said you explained market volatility to him using pizza delivery routes as an analogy." I flushed slightly, remembering that particular tutoring session. I was just trying to make economic concepts more relatable. Sometimes abstract theories make more sense when you connect them to real-world examples. "Would you be interested in having coffee sometime? I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on market analysis." That coffee meeting turned into 3 hours of intense discussion about global economics, emerging technologies, and investment opportunities that traditional firms were overlooking. Orion, I learned, was a former tech entrepreneur who'd sold his company for a substantial sum and now worked as an independent investor, funding promising startups and innovative business models. "You have an unusual way of thinking about risk assessment," he told me as we sat in a corner booth of a downtown cafe. "Most people see patterns where they expect to see patterns. You see patterns where they actually exist." By the end of our conversation, he'd offered me something I hadn't dared to hope for: an opportunity. Not charity, not pity, but a chance to prove what I could do with my mind instead of my family name. "I'm putting together a small investment fund focused on overlooked opportunities. I need someone young, brilliant, and hungry to help me research potential investments. The pay isn't much to start, but you'd learn more about real finance in 6 months than most people learn in 6 years of business school." I accepted immediately, not just because I needed the money, but because Orion was offering me something more valuable: the chance to build expertise that belonged entirely to me. Working for Orion Cross was like attending the world's most intense MBA program compressed into 18-hour days and fueled by determination and spite. His investment fund operated out of a modest office in the financial district, far removed from the gleaming towers where Vail Industries conducted its business, but the work we did there was cutting-edge and ruthless. "Forget everything you think you know about traditional investment strategies," Orion told me on my first day. "The big firms make money by following established patterns and leveraging massive resources. We're going to make money by being smarter, faster, and more creative than they are." My job started with research. Endless hours analyzing emerging companies, studying market trends, and identifying opportunities that larger firms were too conservative or too slow to recognize. I lived on coffee and determination, spending my days buried in financial reports and my nights learning everything I could about international markets, cryptocurrency, and technology investments. But Orion's real gift wasn't just teaching me about finance, it was showing me how to think like a predator instead of a prey. "Your family threw you away because they thought you were expendable," he told me during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "They made a critical error of judgment. Never let anyone underestimate you again, but never correct their mistake until it's too late for them to recover." Under his guidance, I learned to be invisible while being everywhere, to gather information without revealing my intentions, and to build power so quietly that no one noticed until it was too late to stop me. We started small, identifying undervalued properties in developing neighborhoods, investing in startups that bigger firms had rejected, and buying debt from companies that traditional investors considered too risky. Our first major success came 8 months after I started working for Orion. We'd identified a small tech company that had developed revolutionary battery technology, but was struggling with manufacturing costs. While established firms hesitated, we provided the bridge funding they needed to scale production.
6 months later, when Tesla announced a partnership with the company, our initial investment had increased by 4,000%. "This is just the beginning," Orion told me as we celebrated our windfall. "You're starting to understand how real wealth is built, not through inheritance or luck, but through intelligence, timing, and the willingness to act when others won't." As my reputation in Orion's circle grew, I began hearing whispers from the world I'd left behind. Through careful networking and strategic conversations, I learned that Vale Industries was facing increasing pressure. Cale's reckless spending had escalated, and his attempts to cover his tracks were becoming more desperate and more visible. The Henderson partnership withdrawal had been just the beginning. Other long-term clients were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the company's financial practices. But more importantly, I discovered something that made my blood run cold with possibility. Vale Industries was heavily leveraged, with significant debt obligations coming due over the next several years. The empire that had seemed so unshakable was actually built on a foundation of borrowed money and projected future earnings. If the right pressure were applied at the right time, the entire structure could collapse. One late night, as I sat in my tiny apartment reviewing investment portfolios, I realized I was no longer the desperate 17-year-old who'd been cast out of her family home. I had skills now, resources, and most importantly, I had learned to think like my father, ruthlessly, strategically, and without sentiment. I pulled out a notebook and began making a list, not of investments or market opportunities, but of every piece of property, every business partnership, and every debt obligation connected to Vale Industries. If my family wanted to play games with loyalty and betrayal, I would show them how those games were really won. The girl they'd thrown away was gone. In her place sat a woman who understood exactly how to use their own weapons against them. And I was just getting started. 3 years after my exile, I had transformed from a discarded daughter into something my father would have respected if he'd known I existed. A predator with perfect camouflage. My investment portfolio, built under Orion's guidance and my own relentless research, had grown to over $15 million. But more importantly, I had spent those 3 years methodically mapping every weakness in the Vale Industries empire, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Cale's addictions finally spiraled beyond even his ability to hide them. Through my carefully cultivated network of contacts in Chicago's financial district, I learned that my brother had graduated from stealing from client accounts to something far more dangerous. He was embezzling from employee pension funds and using the company's assets as collateral for his gambling debts. The information came to me through Marcus Cross, Orion's nephew, who now worked as a junior analyst at a competing firm. During one of our regular coffee meetings, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold with possibility. "There's weird chatter about Vale Industries," he said, stirring sugar into his espresso. "Word is they're scrambling to cover some major shortfalls. My boss thinks they might be looking at bankruptcy within the year if they can't secure emergency funding." I kept my expression carefully neutral, but inside, my heart was racing. Really? I thought they were one of Chicago's most stable firms. "That's what everyone thought," Marcus continued, oblivious to the significance of his words. "But apparently someone's been playing fast and loose with the books for years. The SEC is starting to sniff around, and their biggest clients are pulling out. It's a mess." That night, I called an emergency meeting with Orion. We met at his private club, a discreet establishment where Chicago's most influential power brokers conducted business away from prying eyes. Over brandy and cigars, I laid out everything I'd learned about my family's crumbling empire. "The pension fund theft is the smoking gun," I explained, spreading financial documents across the mahogany table between us. "If that information becomes public, Vale Industries will face federal charges, class action lawsuits, and immediate bankruptcy. But if someone were to step in and quietly acquire their debt obligations before the news breaks..." Orion's eyes gleamed with understanding. "That someone would own everything they've built when the collapse happens." Exactly. I pulled out a folder containing 3 years' worth of research. I've identified every property, every subsidiary, every major contract they hold. I know which banks hold their debt, which clients are already wavering, and exactly how much pressure it would take to topple the entire structure. And you want to be the one applying that pressure.
I met his gaze steadily.
I want to own them completely before they even realize they're being hunted." Orion was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the calculating expression that had made him millions in the tech industry. "This isn't just business for you, is it? This is personal." "Does it matter?" I asked. "The opportunity exists regardless of my motivation. Vale Industries is a failing company with valuable assets. We be doing exactly what we always do, identifying overlooked opportunities and acting while others hesitate." "Fair enough." He gathered the papers and capped them into a neat stack. "But Serenya, once we start this, there's no going back. If you want revenge against your family, this will destroy them completely. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about 17-year-old me, packing my life into cardboard boxes while my father watched from his window. I remembered Cale's smug expression as he accused me of theft, my mother's silence, the cold dismissal that had nearly broken me. "They made their choice 3 years ago," I said quietly. "Now, I'm making mine." Over the next 6 months, I became a ghost haunting my family's empire. Using shell companies and intermediaries, I began quietly purchasing Vale Industries' debt from banks that were eager to offload what they increasingly saw as toxic assets. The beauty of my approach was its invisibility. Each transaction appeared to be just another routine transfer of commercial debt, nothing that would raise alarms or warrant investigation. My first major acquisition was the mortgage on the Vale family estate itself. The North Shore mansion that had been my childhood home was leveraged against a series of business loans that Damien had used to fund expansion projects. When the holding bank decided to reduce their exposure to commercial real estate, I bought the entire debt package for 60 cents on the dollar. The second purchase was more complex, but infinitely more satisfying: the intellectual property rights to Vale Industries' most valuable patents. Years of poor financial management had forced my father to use the company's innovations as collateral for operating capital. When the tech firm holding those rights decided to liquidate their patent portfolio, I ensured that my investment group was the highest bidder. But the crown jewel of my strategy was gaining control of the Henderson Development Project, the same partnership that had provided the excuse for my exile. The real estate venture had been struggling due to cost overruns and regulatory delays. Exactly the kind of distressed asset that traditional investors avoided, but that offered enormous potential for someone willing to play the long game. Each acquisition was carefully timed and structured to avoid detection. To any outside observer, Vale Industries was simply facing the normal pressures of a competitive market. What they couldn't see was that I was systematically purchasing every rope they might use to pull themselves out of their sinking ship. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using everything my father had taught me about business strategy to dismantle the empire he'd built in the first place. Every lesson about leveraging debt, every insight into market timing, every principle of strategic thinking, all of it was being turned against the man who'd given me those tools in the first place. The most challenging part wasn't the financial maneuvering, it was maintaining my emotional equilibrium while watching my family's world collapse from the inside. Through Lyra, who had maintained secret contact with me despite the family's prohibition, I learned that the stress was taking a visible toll on everyone in the Vale household. "Dad's drinking more," she told me during one of our clandestine meetings at a coffee shop far from the family's usual haunts. "I can smell it on him during breakfast, and Mom started taking pills to sleep. She thinks no one notices, but her words slur sometimes in the evenings." Lyra had grown into a beautiful 18-year-old with the same sharp intelligence that ran in our family, but I could see the strain of living in the Vale household etched around her eyes. She'd managed to document much of Cale's financial crimes, just as she had promised, but the evidence was useless without someone willing to act on it. "Cale's getting desperate," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He knows someone's buying up the company's debt, but he can't figure out who. He's convinced it's a hostile takeover attempt by one of Dad's competitors. Last week, I heard him screaming at Dad about hiring private investigators to find out who's behind it." The image of my brother panicking while I systematically dismantled his future filled me with a satisfaction that was both thrilling and disturbing.
But I pushed those feelings aside and focused on the practical implications. How much longer do you think they have before everything falls apart publicly? Months, maybe weeks, Lyra said grimly. The pension fund shortfall is getting harder to hide, and the SEC investigation is moving faster than anyone expected. When the news breaks, it's going to be a feeding frenzy. As I watched my sister struggle with the guilt of knowing her family's secrets while being powerless to fix them, I felt a moment of doubt about the path I had chosen. But then I remembered the choice my parents had given me 3 years ago. Take the blame for Kayla's
crimes or lose everything. They'd been willing to sacrifice one daughter to protect their precious son and heir. Now it was time for them to learn what sacrifice really looked like. The beginning of the end came on a cold Tuesday morning in November when the Securities and Exchange Commission executed a surprise raid on Vale Industries headquarters. I watched the news coverage from my office, seeing federal agents carrying boxes of documents out of the building where I'd once dreamed of working alongside my father. The media coverage was devastating but predictable. Vale Industries under federal investigation for pension fund fraud, screamed the headlines. Chicago business dynasty faces bankruptcy amid embezzlement scandal. Within hours, the company's stock price had plummeted, their remaining clients were fleeing, and every major bank in the city was calling in their loans. What the reporters didn't know, what only I knew, was that the mysterious entity now holding most of Vale Industries' debt was a shell company controlled by Serenya Vale, the name I'd been using for business purposes since my exile. To anyone conducting due diligence, Serenya Vale was simply a successful young investor with no apparent connection to the Vale family. The beauty of my 3-year strategy was becoming clear. While my family scrambled to find emergency funding to keep their empire afloat, I controlled the very lifelines they needed to survive. Every asset they might sell, every property they might leverage, every partnership they might call upon, I had quietly positioned myself to block their access to salvation. My phone rang constantly with calls from financial journalists, investment firms, and distressed asset specialists who wanted to discuss the Vale Industries situation. I took only the most important calls, maintaining my cover as a disinterested third party who happened to have exposure to their debt portfolio. Ms. Cross, said Richard Blackwood, a senior partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, during a call that came 2 days after the federal raid, I represent Vale Industries in their current difficulties. We understand that your investment group holds significant debt obligations related to our client. We'd like to discuss potential restructuring arrangements. I leaned back in my office chair, savoring the moment. I'm certainly open to discussions, Mr. Blackwood. What kind of restructuring did you have in mind? Well, given the current market conditions and regulatory environment, Vale Industries is prepared to offer very favorable terms for debt forgiveness. We're talking about substantial equity positions in exchange for forbearance on debt service. Equity in a company under federal investigation for fraud? I kept my voice professionally skeptical. I'm afraid my investors would find that rather speculative. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Blackwood becoming increasingly desperate as I politely declined each offer while maintaining the facade of a cautious but potentially cooperative creditor. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't interested in restructuring, I was interested in complete ownership. That evening, Lyra sent me a text message that consisted of just 3 words. Dad wants out. I called her immediately. What do you mean? He's talking about liquidating everything, she whispered, clearly speaking from somewhere in the house where she wouldn't be overheard. Selling the company, the house, all of it. He thinks if he can pay back the pension funds and cooperate with the SEC, he might avoid prison. And Cale? Cale is in complete denial. He's convinced this is all some kind of misunderstanding that Dad's lawyers can fix. He doesn't understand that this is the end. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the moment I'd been working toward for 3 years was finally at hand. My family was about to discover that their mysterious creditor wasn't some faceless investment firm or foreign entity. It was the daughter they'd thrown away, the girl they'd sacrificed to protect their precious heir. Tomorrow, I would schedule a meeting with Vale Industries representatives. I would sit across a conference table from my father for the first time in 3 years, and I would watch his face when he realized that everything he built,
everything he'd fought to protect, now belonged to me. The girl who'd been cast out with nothing was about to become the woman who owned everything. And unlike my family, I had no intention of showing mercy to those who had shown me none. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Friday morning in the neutral territory of Blackwood & Associates' downtown conference room. As I walked through the marble lobby of the building that housed Chicago's most expensive legal talent, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony that my family was now paying top dollar for the privilege of negotiating their surrender to me. I had chosen my outfit carefully for this moment, a charcoal gray Armani suit that projected authority without ostentation, paired with the same style of understated jewelry that Celine had always favored. My hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the sharp angles
of my face. And I carried the same model of Italian leather briefcase that my father had used throughout my childhood. Every detail was calculated to remind him of the daughter he'd raised before he'd thrown her away. Orion had offered to accompany me, but this was something I needed to do alone. 3 years of planning, 3 years of careful maneuvering, 3 years of becoming someone my family would never recognize. All of it had led to this single moment when I would finally step out of the shadows and claim what was mine. The receptionist, a polished young woman who probably earned more in a month than I'd made in my first year of exile, directed me to conference room A. "Ms. Cross, they're waiting for you. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." My voice was steady, betraying none of the anticipation that was building in my chest like a storm about to break. I paused outside the conference room door, taking a moment to center myself. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of 4 people seated around a long table. In just a few seconds, I would walk through that door and watch my father's world collapse around him. The girl he'd abandoned would reveal herself as the woman who now controlled his fate. I opened the door and stepped inside. The reaction was immediate and devastating. My father, seated at the head of the table with his back to me, turned at the sound of my entrance. The color drained from his face so completely that for a moment I thought he might actually faint. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly like a fish gasping for air. Beside him, Richard Blackwood rose to his feet with a confused expression. "Ms. Cross, I presume? Thank you for—" He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed my father's reaction, then looked back at me with growing bewilderment. But it was the third person in the room who provided the most satisfying reaction of all. Cale, slouched in his chair with the entitled arrogance that had defined his entire life, slowly straightened as recognition dawned on his face. The transformation was beautiful to watch, confusion giving way to shock, shock to fear, and fear to the kind of desperate panic that accompanies the realization that your worst nightmare has come true. "Hello, Dad," I said quietly, setting my briefcase on the table with the same deliberate precision he'd always used in business meetings. "Cale, it's been a while." "This is impossible," Cale whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. You can't be Serenya Cross?" The last words came out as a strangled question, as though saying them might somehow make them untrue. "Serenya Vale Cross," I corrected, taking the seat directly across from my father. "I kept the family name. I thought it was important to remember where I came from, even after you made it clear I wasn't welcome where I was going." Damien finally found his voice, though it sounded nothing like the commanding tone that had once made boardrooms fall silent. "Serenya, how did I become the mysterious investor who now owns your empire?" I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I learned from the best, Dad. You taught me everything I needed to know about identifying weakness, leveraging opportunity, and striking when your opponents are most vulnerable. I'm just applying those lessons to a target you probably never expected." Richard Blackwood was frantically flipping through documents, trying to make sense of what was happening. I don't understand, Miss Cross. You're saying you're related to our clients? There's a massive conflict of interest here. This entire negotiation is compromised."
There's no conflict of interest, Mr. Blackwood, I replied calmly. I'm here as a representative of the Cross Investment Group, which holds approximately 87% of Vale Industries' debt obligations. The fact that I happen to share DNA with your clients is irrelevant to our business relationship. Irrelevant? Kel's voice was rising toward hysteria. You're our sister. You can't destroy your own family. I turned to look at him fully for the first time, taking in the changes that 3 years and escalating addiction had wrought. His face was gaunt. His expensive suit hung loose on a frame that had lost the athletic build of his college years. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water, and I could see the telltale signs of someone trying to function while battling withdrawal. My family? I repeated softly. That's interesting, Kale, because I distinctly remember being told that I was no longer part of this family. In fact, it seems like my father's exact words were that I would be on my own after I refused to take the blame for your theft. That was different. We were trying to protect the company, protect all of us. If you just admitted to taking the Henderson money, we could have made it right privately. No one else would have been hurt. The words came out sharper than I had intended, carrying 3 years of buried rage. Except me. I would have been destroyed. My reputation ruined. My future obliterated. But that was acceptable collateral damage, wasn't it? As long as the golden child was protected, as long as the heir apparent could continue his path towards taking over the empire?
My father finally seemed to regain some of his composure, though his face remained ashen. Serenya, you have to understand the position we were in. The company was facing a crisis. We had to make difficult choices. Difficult choices. I opened my briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents. Let me tell you about difficult choices, Dad. Like choosing between food and textbooks during my first semester of exile. Like working 3 jobs while attending college full-time because I couldn't afford to fail. Like learning to rebuild my entire identity from nothing because the family name I'd carried for 17 years had been stripped away. I spread the documents across the table. Every debt instrument, every property deed, every contract that now bore my signature instead of theirs. These are the difficult choices I made, while you were covering up Kale's escalating crimes and hoping the problems would solve themselves. You don't understand, Kale said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone I remembered from childhood when he was trying to talk his way out of trouble. The gambling wasn't supposed to get out of hand. I had a system, a way to make quick money to cover the small amounts I'd borrowed. If you hadn't forced our hand by refusing to cooperate, I could have paid everything back. Small amounts. I pulled out another document and slid it across the table. $12 million from employee pension funds, $3 million from client trust accounts, another $8 million in unauthorized loans using assets as collateral. That's $23 million, Kale. Even by Vale family standards, that's not small change. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Blackwood was staring at the documents with growing horror, clearly realizing that his clients had been lying to him about the scope of their legal exposure. My father had buried his face in his hands, and Kale was slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. The truly beautiful part, I continued, my voice conversational now, is that I didn't have to fabricate any of this evidence. I didn't have to lie or manipulate or frame anyone for crimes they didn't commit. I simply had to wait for the truth to surface and position myself to capitalize on the inevitable collapse. "What do you want?" my father asked quietly, his words muffled by his hands. "Money? Revenge? What will it take for you to walk away and let us try to salvage something from this mess?" I leaned back in my chair, studying the broken man who had once seemed like a titan to my teenage eyes. "What do I want? I want you to understand what you threw away 3 years ago. I want you to realize that the daughter you abandoned became everything you claimed to value. Intelligent, ruthless, successful, and completely loyal to her own interests above all else." "Serenya, please,"
My father looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine desperation in his eyes. We're family. Whatever mistakes we made, whatever happened in the past, we're still family. That has to count for something. Family. I tested the word like I was tasting something that had gone sour. You know what I learned about family during my exile, Dad? Real family stands by you when you're right, not when it's convenient. Real family protects the innocent, not the guilty. Real family doesn't sacrifice one child to save another. I stood up, gathering my documents with the same methodical precision I'd learned from watching him conduct business throughout my childhood. You want to know what I want. I want you to understand what you felt that night when you gave me an ultimatum. I want you to understand what it's like to lose everything because someone you trusted decided you were expendable. So, you're going to destroy us completely? Cale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm going to give you the same choice you gave me. I walking toward the door. You can accept responsibility for your crimes and cooperate with the federal investigation, in which case I might consider restructuring your debt obligations to allow you to keep the family home and a modest settlement. Or you can fight this and lose absolutely everything, including your freedom when the SEC prosecution moves forward. I paused at the door and turned back to face them one last time. You have until Monday morning to decide. After that, I'll assume you've chosen to fight, and I'll proceed accordingly. As I reached for the door handle, my father's voice stopped me. Serenya, wait. You're right. About all of it. We failed you. I failed you. But please, think about what this will do to your mother, to Lyra. They don't deserve to pay for our mistakes. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the girl I'd been before they'd taught me to be ruthless. Mom had 18 years to stand up for what was right. She chose silence. As for Lyra, I smiled, and this time it was genuine. Lyra will be taken care of. She's the only one who remembered what family actually means. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the wreckage of the Vale family empire and the men who had underestimated the girl they had thrown away. In 3 days, they would choose to cooperate with the investigation and accept the terms I'd offered. Cale would serve 2 years in minimum security prison, my father would lose his business licenses and most of his wealth, and the Vale family name would become synonymous with financial scandal in Chicago's business community. But I would own the company my great-grandfather had built, the mansion where I'd spent my childhood, and every significant asset they'd accumulated over 3 generations.
Importantly, I would own the knowledge that I'd succeeded not despite their betrayal, but because of it. As I walked through the marble lobby toward the street, my phone buzzed with a text from Lyra. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. I smiled and stepped out into the Chicago sunlight, no longer the abandoned daughter of the Vale family, but the founder of an empire that would eclipse anything they'd ever built. And unlike them, I would never forget the cost of loyalty or the price of betrayal. But as I reached my car, I realized the confrontation wasn't quite finished. There was one more piece of business to complete, one final twist of the knife that would ensure my family understood exactly how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized but never called. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Celine Vale speaking. Hello, Mother. The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me everything I needed to know. She'd been expecting this call, probably since the moment Dad had stumbled home from the meeting and told her who held their fate in her hands. Serenya. Her voice was barely a whisper. I heard about the meeting, about what you've become. What I've become? I repeated, settling into the driver's seat of my car, but making no move to start the engine. That's an interesting way to phrase it. What exactly do you think I've become, Mom? You're successful, powerful,
Everything your father always said you could be if you applied yourself properly. I laughed, and the sound was bitter even to my own ears. Successful, yes, but not in the way he intended, is it? Tell me, Mother, are you proud of what your daughter has accomplished? Are you impressed by the empire I've built from absolutely nothing? The silence stretched between us, filled with 20 years of unspoken truths and carefully maintained facades. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. I'm sorry, Serenya, for all of it. For not standing up for you when you needed me, for choosing the easy path instead of the right one, for letting them destroy my daughter to protect my son. Your son, I said softly. That's what it always came down to, wasn't it? Cale was your son, your precious firstborn who could do no wrong. I was just... What exactly was I to you, Mom? You were my brilliant, stubborn, magnificent daughter who refused to bend even when bending would have saved you. And I hated myself for watching them break you, but I didn't know how to stop it. For the first time since I'd walked into that conference room, I felt my carefully constructed composure crack. You could have said something, anything. You could have told the truth about who really stole that money. You could have chosen your daughter over your son, just once. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting that choice. But Serenya, please, can you find it in your heart to forgive a weak woman who made the wrong choice when it mattered most? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years' worth of rage and pain and carefully planned revenge. In that moment, I had to decide who I wanted to be, the ruthless woman who would destroy even the weakest link in the chain that had bound me, or someone who could find mercy for a mother who had failed her daughter but never stopped loving her. I'm not going to destroy you, Mom. The house will remain in family hands. Your hands, specifically. There will be enough money for you to live comfortably, though not lavishly, but there are conditions. Anything, she breathed. First, you divorce Dad. You've spent 25 years enabling his worst impulses and sacrificing your own integrity to maintain his empire. That ends now. Second, you use your remaining social connections to ensure that Lyra has every opportunity I was denied. Good colleges, influential mentors, doors that open because of merit rather than money. Can you do that? Yes, of course. But Serenya, what about you? Will I ever see you again? Will you ever be able to forgive me enough to let me be part of your life? I started the car, needing the sound of the engine to fill the silence while I considered her question. I don't know, Mom. Maybe someday, but not yet. I need to build something new from what they destroyed, and I can't do that while looking backward.
I understand. Her voice was steady now, resigned but somehow relieved. For what it's worth, I am proud of you. Terrified of what you've become, but proud. You accomplished something none of us thought possible. You became more powerful than the people who tried to destroy you. After I hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, watching the people of Chicago go about their Friday afternoon routines. Somewhere in the city, my father was probably explaining to his lawyers how his abandoned daughter had become his executioner. Somewhere else, Cale was likely drowning his terror in whatever substances he could find, still unable to accept that his crimes had finally caught up with him. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt something approaching peace. The girl who had been cast out of her family home was truly gone. But what had replaced her wasn't just a ruthless businesswoman driven by revenge. She was someone who understood that true power came not from destroying your enemies, but from building something so strong and so valuable that it could survive anything they tried to do to it. My phone buzzed with another text from Lyra. Dad just called. He said you won. I'm scared, but also relieved? Does that make sense? I typed back quickly. It makes perfect sense. Come see me Sunday. We have a lot to talk about. As I pulled into traffic, heading back toward the offices where Orion was waiting to hear how the meeting had gone,
I realized that my story was far from over. The Vale family empire was finished, but the Cross Investment Group was just beginning. I had companies to acquire, investments to make, and an entirely new legacy to build. Most importantly, I had a sister to mentor and guide, ensuring that she would never face the choice between integrity and family that had defined my own young adulthood. Lyra would have every advantage I'd been denied, every opportunity that money and influence could provide, but she would also have something more valuable: the knowledge that true families stood by each other regardless of the cost. The girl they'd cast out was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned to turn pain into power, exile into opportunity, and family betrayal into the foundation of her own empire. But unlike them, she would remember that power without principles was just another form of poverty. Some lessons, once learned, could never be unlearned, and some reckonings were worth waiting for. But the best revenge, I had discovered, wasn't destruction at all. It was building something so magnificent that it made your enemy's accomplishments look like children's toys by comparison. And that was exactly what I intended to do.